The whole nervous system of a human being is quite intriguing, complex, and sometimes even a bit mysterious. Modern science is aware of the fact that our nervous system produces specific substances called neurotransmitters. Their main role is to regulate the function of target organs. Dopamine is a good example of a neurotransmitter as it is responsible for controlling many of our bodily functions. In today's video, we will talk about what happens when there is too much dopamine released in the brain. Before we dive into the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel with notifications on so you do not miss any of the new videos we post. First, let us talk briefly about the function of dopamine in our body. As we already mentioned, dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters secreted by our brain. It basically acts as a messenger between the neurons. Dopamine affects many of our physical and behavioral actions. Those of you who have heard about it probably know that dopamine usually goes by the name the feel-good neurotransmitter. The reason for this is that dopamine is mostly associated with reward and pleasure. It is released when our brain is expecting a reward. So how does dopamine affect our behavioral and physical functions? When our brain releases a certain amount of dopamine, we feel more alive, alert. It's easier to concentrate, focus on a certain topic, so learning becomes easier. Dopamine is also responsible for motivation and generally feeling of happiness. Aside from making us feel good, this neurotransmitter also regulates many of our body functions like blood flow, digestion, heart rate, kidney function, mood, emotions, motor control, processing of brain sensation, pancreatic function, insulin regulation, sleep, stress response, and so on. Now, let us talk about what happens when there is too much dopamine. There are many reasons why dopamine levels may be increased above the threshold. Many drugs, like cocaine, can cause a rapid increase in dopamine levels. Also, many behaviors like gambling, for example, can cause the dopamine levels to spike. Aside from all that, one might just have a hyperactive dopamine system, which means that the body response in relating to dopamine to a certain stimulus is much higher than it should be. Sometimes there's too much dopamine in the whole system. In other cases, a high amount of dopamine is just concentrated in certain parts of the brain. But whatever that is, an increased level of this neurotransmitter is linked to an altered behavior like mania, aggression, poor impulse control. It can also lead to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, binge eating, addiction to gambling, overly euphoric state, and even hallucinations and schizophrenia. Matthäus Willeit of MedUni's Vienna Department of Psychiatry and Psychotherapy explained about this matter on the Dopamine 2016 conference, which took place on the Vienna University campus at MedUni's Vienna Center for Brain Research. Excessive dopamine releases at the wrong moment can cause insignificant things to take on an unwarranted significance. This can even result in mania, hallucinations, or even schizophrenia. Dopamine is also quite well known for its addictive nature. It is quite noteworthy that too much dopamine plays a big role in addiction. As the feel-good neurotransmitter, it makes people feel better. Over time, it becomes a habit for some people to crave for activities that help in dopamine release. In some cases, this may even turn into a self-destructive coping mechanism. Stimulus can be anything: sugary food, sex, alcohol, or drugs. Over time, addictive substances overload the brain with dopamine, which causes a slow decrease in sensitivity of dopamine receptors. As a result, a higher amount of dopamine is required to achieve the same sensation of pleasure as initially caused by a certain substance. When the addictive substances are not delivered in higher amounts, symptoms of withdrawal appear. Here is what Harold Seit of MedUni's Vienna Institute of Pharmacology said: dopamine release is also responsible for people becoming addicted, in that they are always seeking pleasure so that they can reach higher and higher dopamine levels. Dopamine is the reason why a lot of people are constantly seeking to satisfy their cravings. Now, let us talk about dopamine and obesity. Scientists think that because of the addictive nature this neurotransmitter has, it may be linked to obesity. To put it differently, an increased amount of dopamine is associated with people gaining weight. So the studies have been conducted by the scientists at the U.S. Department of Energy's Brookhaven National Laboratory. It basically showed that these obese people had fewer dopamine receptors, meaning that they needed more dopamine for its effect, and their way of stimulating dopamine pleasure circuits was to eat more. The results from this study suggest that strategies aimed at improving dopamine function might be beneficial in the treatment of these obese individuals, says physician Jean-Jacques Wang, the main scientist on the study. Since eating, like the use of addictive drugs, is a highly reinforcing behavior, inducing feelings of gratification and pleasure, we suspected that these obese people might have abnormalities in brain dopamine activity as well, says Nora Volko, the psychiatrist who also participated in the study. It is also interesting that regular exercise also affects the level of dopamine in our brain. In animal studies conducted elsewhere, exercise has been found to increase dopamine release and to raise the number of dopamine receptors, Volko says. So it is possible for obese people to boost their dopamine response through exercise instead of eating. Next up, we'll talk about dopamine and schizophrenia. As we already mentioned, increased amounts of dopamine is associated with developing schizophrenia. Let us have a deeper look into this topic. Here is what G. Grunder writes in the Neurobiology of Schizophrenia, the dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia, which was formulated in the 1960s after the discovery of antipsychotic actions of chlorpromazine was extremely successful as a heuristic principle for interpreting aspects of the phenomenology of schizophrenia. The development of improved antipsychotic medications was guided by a search for dopamine blockers based on the concept that schizophrenia is, in part, a hyperdopaminergic state. Molecular imaging studies performed over the last 25 years strongly support an association of increased subcortical dopamine transmission with the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Increased dopamine is also associated with a condition called Huntington disease. Huntington disease is a neurodegenerative movement disorder that is characterized with involuntary and irregular movements of the limbs. It is a genetic disorder, and because of this genetic defect, there is an increased production of dopamine, which is thought to be responsible for the clinical symptoms. Here is what PubMed writes about this matter. The mechanisms of DA dysfunction, in particular the increased DA tone in the early stages of the disease, are presently unknown but may include initial upregulation of DA neuron activity caused by the genetic mutation, reduced inhibition resulting from striatal MSN loss, increased excitation from cortical inputs, and DA autoreceptor dysfunction. Targeting both DA and glutamate receptor dysfunction could be the best strategy to treat HD symptoms. Let us discuss the role of dopamine in manic episodes. Mania is a mood disorder. It can present as an isolated episode or can be part of a bipolar disorder. Manic episode is a state where a person is overly confident, energetic, and, to put in other words, believes he can conquer the whole world. This state is very dangerous and requires immediate hospitalization. As you might guess, a person in this state is ready to commit very reckless acts. There have been cases where people in manic states would try to rob a bank or do other dangerous activities that their conscience would not allow them to do in a normal state. As we already mentioned, dopamine is a happy neurotransmitter. Sometimes it can even trick our brain into being too happy and maybe overconfident. Now we will talk about the relationship between increased dopamine and insomnia. We have all experienced some sleep deprivation at one point or another, but when we talk about insomnia, it is literally a full night without sleep. In the long term, it may become really bad. We all know what sleep deprivation does to people. Unable to pay attention, suppressed immune system, unable to think straight, unable to talk normally, and so on. But why do these things happen? What kind of changes occur in our brain? So the increased dopamine is thought to be at least partly responsible for insomnia. Here is what an article writer and the scientist, the Sericious Brain, writes about it. There are lots of signs that point toward the involvement of the neurotransmitter dopamine in wakefulness. Drugs that increase levels of dopamine in the brain, including but not limited to drugs like cocaine, amphetamine, meth, and Ritalin, also increase feelings of wakefulness. Increasing dopamine in the brain via genetic alterations like getting rid of the dopamine transporter in a mouse, stopping dopamine from getting recycled, produces a mouse that sleeps less. Diseases that are characterized by low dopamine levels like Parkinson's also have daytime sleepiness, but a neurotransmitter is only as good as its receptor. Dopamine has two main types of receptors, and the current hypothesis is that the wakefulness-promoting effects of dopamine may be controlled partially by the D2 type receptor. But the question is, what is causing the decrease in D2 when people are sleep deprived? The authors of this study hypothesized that this was due to increased dopamine release, which would cause decreases in D2 receptors. On this note, we end our video. These were just some examples of what can happen when you have too much dopamine released in your brain. We would like to know your opinion about the video. What was the information you found most interesting? Do you agree with everything we said? Don't hesitate to leave a comment down below and press the like button if you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching, and we hope to see you in the next video.